Hi, I'm Arthur, and this is going to be one of the most complicated videos I've made in such a long time. I mean this with all the kindness and caring I can muster in my long dead heart, that talking about the Primarchs is usually a mixture of being a little cut and dry, while also being a bit of a deep cut into my own psyche. For those who are new here, hello, I'm Arthur Bones. I talk about stuff in 40k from the perspective of your drunken, possibly degenerate friend, whom also tends to say things a little out of turn while he's around a little too often. And this is part 7 in a 20-part series I am doing, covering all of the Primarchs in order of the legions. No, you don't have to have seen the other parts to understand this one. I mostly just say as such as a guide to go learn about the Primarchs from the perspective of an escaped asylum patient. Speaking of an escaped asylum patient, Konrad Curze, who is responsible for the most typos from my dyslexic ass of any other Primarch. Seriously, I can never remember if it's Konrad with a K or a C or Curze with a K or a C. I know it's one of each. But that's besides the point. So memes aside, I'm going to play my hand a little early. The Night Lords are my favorite legion of Space Marines. Now, it is a bit close from time to time depending on what book I'm reading. The second place could be different depending on the day you ask. I love the Emperor's Spears, I love the Black Templars, but the Night Lords are usually number one. But when it comes to Primarchs, my number one pick is always going to be Konrad Curze, and second place is not even remotely going to be close. I think second place would probably be like the Lion or maybe Rabute Gilliman, again depending on the day, but the gulf of space between first place and second place is the width of the Pacific Ocean from my perspective. Konrad Curze, in my opinion, is one of the most interesting characters in the setting of 30k, and has one of the most interesting legacies of all the Primarchs, who are confirmed to have been dead, but also interesting legacies in terms of what their legion ended up doing afterwards. But out of all of the Primarchs that are dead or alive, Curze is the only Primarch to have canonically... Okay, YouTube, don't demonetize me for this. I'm skirting around this, but everybody here read between the lines. Allowed his death to happen under his own terms, which, if you were to throw that idea at any other Primarch and see how they felt about it, they'd probably just laugh in your face. But I am jumping ahead a bit. Let's break this down into a beginning, a middle, and an end, where the beginning we discuss who he is, in the middle we discuss what he did, and in the end we discuss how we feel. So who is Konrad Curze? Comically enough, calling him Curze is a bit of a misnomer. See, he was sent to a planet known as Nostramo, which is the shittiest planet to have ever been a shitty planet for very different reasons than other planets can be shitty in this setting. It's not populated by incredibly dangerous animals exclusively, you know, no demon tigers or krakens. It's that special kind of immoral shithole that kinda pops up from time to time. Gang activity and an almost sunless existence bathes the only habitable side of the planet, which, if you don't know anything about human brain chemistry, we kind of need the sun to exist mentally for long periods of time. So with that, mental illness such as depression, anxiety, and weirdly enough schizophrenia are pretty common on Nostramo, which causes it to have the highest crime rate in the entirety of the setting for the time that it existed, which is insane to think about. Curze was sent to this planet, and instead of meeting a loving family or a horrible family, he was forcibly dug deep into the earth by the pod that he was in and had to crawl his child ass out. See, most people saw him as a freak, a monster, and either wanted to exploit him for their own personal gain or kill him. So he just kind of adopted this sort of, fuck 'em all mentality of enforcing justice his own way that is both inherent to the well-intending nature of the Primarchs, which I believe is indicative of every single Primarch, but also through the lens of someone who has only known violence and murder his entire life. So TLDR, he became lawful evil Batman who essentially developed a strong thirst for torture and violence. See, the torturer's knife is a guilt-free blade, meaning you torture one gang member and broadcast their cries to the world around you, and the rest of the gang is probably not going to be so likely to commit said crimes in the future. It's definitely an ends justify the means kind of way of dealing with problems, and I guess from a reductionist point of view, it ends with less bodies being buried in less cemeteries, but I feel if you agree with that mentality that torturing people and public forms of violent and cruel punishments is a good way of warding off criminals, yeah, maybe, you know what? Good luck with life. Good luck. I think you're gonna do just fine. But I digress. Curze was an unpredictable curmudgeon at the best of times. He was violent, he was horrible, but the thing I want to highlight here is his name isn't actually Curze. I mentioned this earlier, that it's a misnomer to refer to him as Konrad Curze because that's the name the Emperor gave him. And about 9 times out of 10, the Primarchs will refer to themselves by the name that was given to them by the Emperor. But Curze never had that kind of genetic memory like, say, Perturabo did, where he instinctively knew that his name was Perturabo. Instead, he adopted a title that fit his dramatis personae, if you will, the Night Haunter, which, weirdly enough, is the name he identified with the most. Even weeks before his death, he still referred to himself as the Night Haunter over Curze. It was more a formality to refer to him as Curze than anything else. He was a monster in the night. Alongside that, through his adventures on Nostramo, you find out that he had psychic capabilities that were similar to if you combine Sanguinius's foresight with the sporadic fits and bursts style nature of Lorgar, where his psychic abilities manifested in sporadic explosive bursts, and they presented themselves as very accurate predictions of possible futures, giving him a wide swath of what could possibly happen, which is very interesting. See, the thing is, colored by his perception of the world, especially being raised on Nostramo, he would be presented with multiple options, usually defined by a positive outcome and a negative one. He would always assume that the most horrible outcome was the most likely one to happen. This fatalism basically was what colored Curze's entire experience to a T. He would always assume the worst of people, and because of that, he would always act like an animal, killing and torturing those that would go against his self-perceived idea of justice and whatnot, and even torturing and killing people for the most basic of crimes, such as petty theft or even wanting to go out the way that he did, which is, you know, again, I can't say much about that topic or even say that funny little S word, or else YouTube will jump down my throat pretty fast. The mentality of the ends justify the means, and fatalism translates pretty hand over fist into the Night Lords as a legion for a time. As with everything involving Primarchs, the troops they ended up governing always are going to fall into this sort of category of the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. But basically their entire existence fell into dealing out punishment, and oddly enough, they conquered a bunch of different worlds, and even though they were the least combat effective legion of Marines, they had a pretty decent compliance record due to the fear they would inspire. If the Night Lords were proclaimed to be going to a system, a lot of planets would just immediately give up because they know what would happen. So come the heresy, and Horus would take the Night Haunter onto his side in order to mess around with loyalists, particularly because Curze drew the short straw and thus had to deal with the Lion for a bit, which see the Thramas Crusade to learn about how well that went. But none of this really matters. We know who Curze is, but the point I want to hone in on the most is one that kind of comes as a revelation upon his death. Curze. After all was said and done, the heresy lost, he destroyed his home planet, or rather, the planet he was raised on, Nostramo, a rotten world. I mentioned this before, that the apple didn't fall far from the tree for a certain period of time with Curze's legion, and that is because after he had purged the majority of crime on the planet and made it so that people were too afraid to act, he left and assumed that things would stay the same no matter how long he was away. But since the monster was away, people were not afraid to look under their bed anymore. So eventually, the children he started to recruit into his legion were getting worse. Criminals before they were 13, murderers before they were 13, deviants one and all, and he noticed this a bit too late because Curze doesn't really have many people skills, so he couldn't really talk to any of them. His only real friend was really, I guess, Sevatar, but that's about it. So, In order to stem the flow of poison, the Night Haunter destroyed Nostramo with very little hesitation. He made it so that every single one of his legion, as best they could, would have to see what happened to their home world. None of them stopped him, but every single one of them had a different reaction. And I really find it's a very harrowing scene to see how far Curze had just fallen at that point. As he was one of the Primarchs that had never really fallen to chaos, he just turned full traitor, which is partially due to the insanity of him having to see the worst things happening all the time because of his psychic gifts. And thus, after Nostramo was destroyed, they discovered a far-off world that was incredibly difficult to get to by the name of Seguelsa. A mostly dead world of dust storms and empty nothings, he created a new fortress there, made from stone, but at the center was a room made of still living bodies of people stitched together, with warp sorcery as well as good old ingenuity and surgery. It was simply referred to as the Screaming Gallery. It is often stated that the Screaming Gallery was a reflection of what was happening in Curze's mind, as it was becoming very apparent that he was starting to unravel even to his legion. Constant seizures, his teeth turning black and rotten, him even drooling when in the middle of conversation because of his lack of control over his own body at this point. His psychic visions, in short, were destroying his mind. He was hallucinating and blacking out more and more, and it was destroying him from the inside out. So when he got visions that an assassin was coming to murder him, he took it as a delight to finally prove his point. As in a moment of clarity, he realized that his entire life's mission was 100% justified. That you have to punish people who commit crimes, no matter who they are and no matter what the crime was as well. You have to punish them with death, particularly a painful death, but death nonetheless. And in this moment of clarity, he realized that he had sided with the wrong side, and he believed that with his death, it would prove to the Emperor that he was right, that the ends justify the means. And this is where one of my favorite lines that Curze had ever said came from, and that is, "Death means nothing in comparison to vindication." And so, he allowed himself to die, which proved, to him at least, all of his negative convictions about the world, that it is nothing but crime and punishment. He died believing what he wanted, and nothing would sway him as such, or nothing ever would, to be honest. And to me, this is one of the most human actions a Primarch has ever committed. It is self-centered, it is incredibly arrogant, it is delusional, it is incredibly flawed, and there isn't even a great degree of intelligence that goes behind it. And I find it deeply relatable that sometimes Primarchs make bad decisions, not even founded on good logic or good intellectual reasoning. They just do it because it fits with their moral compass. We all have self-destructive tendencies, even if we don't acknowledge them. Is that a bad thing? Not necessarily, but is it a good thing? Also, not necessarily. I want to say that when it comes to Curze, I know a lot of people like him. People that will die on this hill of their beliefs, regardless of if they are proven wrong or if they know, morally speaking, that what they are doing is incorrect. Even in moments of extreme clarity, they learn nothing. They simply believe that their ideals just need to be reinforced with whatever behavior they choose to embark upon. And because of that, it's led me to have this kind of observer mentality to these self-destructive behaviors. I have lost many friends to these kinds of ideals that end up getting reinforced by this negative fatalism belief. For those who don't know, I know fatalism is a word that I throw around a lot, and it's not a word that's very commonly used. A lot of people hear the word fatal and assume I mean like death and dying, but no. Fatalism is also basically just predeterminism, that you believe no matter what happens, the result is always going to be the same, no matter how you put it. Now, fatalism is often used in the context of someone believing the worst is always going to happen, and all you can do is mitigate it. You cannot prevent it. I disagree. I am a stark optimist. Even through the worst of times, I am always going to try and strive to have the most positive outlook on life. But I find a lot of people that I've grown to grow attached to just become consumed with this fear, this idea that no matter what happens, the bad thing is always going to happen. It always gets worse. It never gets better. You can never truly recover what you've lost. You can, again, only mitigate what's happened. And that's why I identify with Curze. I have seen people like this. I have friends that are like this right now, that have such fatalistic ideals about the world that they constantly claim realism over, when in fact it's them being incredibly depressed and not understanding that things do get better. I think what makes Curze so especially compelling to me is the fact that he could have been redeemed. I know, hot take, but even the biggest monsters of this setting have a chance at doing the right thing. Even towards the end, when Curze landed on Seguelsa for the first time, he was accompanied by a human slave, someone that he had abducted on a freighter ship that he had ransacked in order to find his way back to Seguelsa. And this human had grown to understand the body language of Curze, and it made it so that he could tell when Curze was to some degree lying. He knew his idiosyncrasies, and when Curze said to his first captain, Sevatar, as well as Talos, Valkyron, and a bunch of other interesting individuals in Night Lord's lore, that things were always going to get worse, or something to that effect, this human slave could tell immediately Curze did not believe that. He was simply riding out the pattern that he had set forth already. And because of that, the human had been killed. Just because Curze did not like being second-guessed and so on and so forth. But I find that very interesting that even in the eyes of a normal human being, you could tell that there was something there for Curze. And in, I believe, the Curze Primarch book, there is a moment wherein a brief moment of hysteria and hallucination, Curze ends up contacting the Emperor. Now, it's probably a hallucination, or it might just be the Emperor contacting him from the Golden Throne, but he simply states that Curze has light inside of him because all Primarchs do. And I find that very interesting. Pessimistic determinism is one of the most interesting parts of him as a character, because even though that idea has been passed down to the more philosophical members of the currently existing Night Lords Legion, there are still Night Lords that show ambition, that show kindness, that show that there is still good inside them, even if their entire belief system and way of going about combat is evil. Curze is my favorite Primarch, one of the most divisive Primarchs, and one of the Primarchs that will likely go down as having the worst fucking fans in history? I'm sorry, I had to say it. Night Lords fans are all weirdos, including myself in that statistic. There is not a single one of them that is kind of normal. It just comes with the territory, right? So what do you think about the Night Haunter? Let me know in the comments, as well as let me know what you feel about the Night Lords and this pessimistic self-defeating circle. I want to know. Also, remember to like and subscribe, as it helps the channel. And if you want to support the channel further, as well as gain access to additional and early content, then become a channel member today. Thanks once again for watching. Until next time, always remember, your chances of dying violently at the hands of Konrad Curze are never zero.